The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay and Marc Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Marc Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
Today we're talking about leadership at a time of fracture and rising social grievance. Across many societies, people feel that decisions are remote, economies don't work for them, and that growth is no longer delivering social progress. Institutions are facing deep skepticism about whether they really understand people's needs or can deliver the outcomes that matter to them. And this is happening at a time when societies urgently need their institutions to be driving rapid change on systemic issues, whether that's tackling climate change, addressing inequality, responding to tech disruption. But polarisation and mistrust means that many are paralysed or even moving backwards. Today's discussion tackles this issue through a focus on place and community, exploring what works and how we build trust and legitimacy in practice. How can institutions reconnect with the people they serve? How can genuine partnership and local insight lead to better decisions, stronger outcomes, and fundamentally to renewed confidence in the future? We're joined by two guests who work with very different communities and histories, offering grounded insights into what effective reconnection looks like. Professor Mike Kenny is head of the Bennett School of Public Policy here in Cambridge. His work includes a focus on economically marginalised and left-behind communities in the UK and how locally grounded decision-making can strengthen democracy. And Jacinta Koolmatrie, an Aboriginal woman from the place known today as Australia. She's worked in the heritage sector, where she explores how Aboriginal communities sustain knowledge, continuity and care for land, and what that can teach us about more effective and enduring decision-making today. We're not presenting the experiences or perspectives of these communities or equivalents, but are keen to explore what can be learned across contexts about power, belonging, responsibility, and what works when institutions seek to rebuild or earn trust.
Jacinta and Mike, thanks so much for joining. And just before we dive into the topic at hand, it'd be really good to get a sense of what brought the two of you to the work, what motivates you to do this work. And Jacinta, if we could start with you.
My background is in heritage work, and so I actually began in archaeology more because I was quite interested in history. But I think the more I learned about the power of that kind of work, I realised that I could really help my communities, and also because for Aboriginal people, we only got counted in the census in 1967. So my parents were born before that, so they weren't even counted as people essentially in Australia. And really there's a responsibility for all Aboriginal people to do kind of this good work. And so I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and so the work that I do is always grounded in community and my responsibility to my direct community, the people that I'm related to, or Aboriginal people more broadly, because I know we don't really get the opportunity to speak in certain places or have the opportunity to learn things. So my work is always motivated by that kind of history of being left out and not being included. And now getting that opportunity to be able to be included in things, yeah.
I've been working in the sort of public policy space mainly as an academic, but also sometimes as an advisor to different governments. And I guess one of the big questions I've always been interested in is about how the kind of identities, the different identities that citizens have, either in place in a local way or indeed national identities or even beyond that. How do those identities affect the way in which citizens behave and respond to government, and how does government understand those identities? Which does it value, and so on? Now I'm the head of a new policy school here at Cambridge, and one of the really exciting and challenging things we're trying to do is to bring some of that understanding and evidence and research on place into the training that we do of the policymakers of, hopefully, of the coming decades.
Marc, we read and understand a lot about the difficulty in creating trust and legitimacy between communities and institutions. In your work, what do you see as driving the challenge of building trust and legitimacy, particularly in developed economies?
I would focus a lot on what's been happening in the economy in a number of those countries. And I think you could really start the story back in the period when there was a kind of very marked shift away from older forms of industrial production and particularly manufacturing. And many communities, their livelihood and sense of what they were and their value was linked to that form of production. And I think you can see different timelines in different countries, but certainly back to the 1980s, maybe a bit before that, that kind of shift out of that form of economic life has all sorts of consequences, mostly damaging for many of those communities. And government, with some exceptions, doesn't really step up to sort of handle and manage that transition well. Then if you roll forward, what you can see is that the new kind of economy that emerges, broadly you might call it kind of digitally based or technologically driven economy, adds, I think, a further layer of disadvantage and inequality, because the places that grow, that do well and that attract people to them are generally places where there's a lot of human capital, people have degrees, and they have certain kinds of skills that work well for the digital economy. And many other places that are not attractors of that kind of economic activity become rather neglected by governments, which are increasingly inclined to think about where can we get growth, where can we build, where's the economic dynamism. So you get this further geographical polarisation, I think, in many places. And then added to that, I think in recent years, you can see a number of different sort of shocks, really, which have impacted particularly on those who are poorest, who are most vulnerable and insecure in our globalized economy. So things like inflation, things like rising energy costs, but also I think particularly the mid-2000s, I think the economic financial crisis there and the fallout from that. So put all that together, and I think what that creates is a sense for many people that the sort of unspoken contract with the state is broken, that government just does not care and is not necessarily going to step in to help them in a way that perhaps they had assumed might be the case. And then just to complete the answer, I guess, that I think layered on top of that are a set of issues that you might put under the heading of culture and identity. So questions about whose voice and values get heard in the public domain, who's government listening to, which places does it care about. I think that's the underlay for a lot of the new sort of politics of division around issues to do with things like immigration, around nationalism and so on. So I think it's multiple causes, but I would very much stress both the economic and the cultural. I mean, what you can see is that citizens, I think, come to ask different questions of the institutions that govern them. And partly that's driven by a corrosive sense of mistrust. But it's also driven in some cases, I think, by a sense that the institutions that govern us, or particularly in this country, in the UK, which is a very centralised country in governance terms, that the institutions and the people at the top of those systems, they don't hear us, they don't notice us, they don't recognise, in particular, the ways in which we live, our experiences and our values. And so I think you begin to see a sort of gap emerging, which is not just about economic performance and delivery, important as that really is, but it's also around values, I think, and worldviews. And obviously, in the UK, we see that played out very dramatically around the Brexit referendum, but I would argue very similar processes are happening in many other countries too.
Jacinta, I'm keen to get your problem diagnosis, but really the consequences of that. You spoke very powerfully in your introduction around themes that Mike's highlighting in a UK context, questions around whose voice counts and who's recognised. And your introduction highlighted identity not being recognised and the importance of having a voice in spaces. What's the practical consequence of that? Because my understanding is this isn't trust that existed and has now eroded. It was never there. There was never that recognition of identity by today's institutions until recently, but yet the trust and legitimacy doesn't yet exist. What are the consequences of that today?
What I see a lot happening is that people are having to play a lot of catch up and repairing damage that has happened. And even when situations where the people who maybe have perpetrated the things that are happening aren't the people that are trying to repair this damage or connect with people, that damage still exists in those places. And it's really hard for a lot of Aboriginal people to find trust in any kind of organisation that isn't familiar to us. And there's a lot, you have to be completely transparent and open and explaining, because, it would take a lot more money to repair the damage if you're not just going directly to us or to communities immediately to find out what we want, what we're comfortable with. If you just go ahead, make decisions straight away and then come and deliver that to us, it's a whole new review of that work again. By the time those decisions are kind of made, people at the top are set in and think that's the way that it's going to be, and very little area to move around and adjust things because those kind of ideas are set in place. It'd be so much more better if people went in with a flexible mind because, the consequences for us have been completely damaging. Our environment is completely destroyed. Essentially, if people had understood that our connections to those places, connection to country, because we use the word country and we use country with a capital C because it's essentially everything to us. We all have different countries. It's over 200 different countries across the continent. So the consequences are just completely damaging.
You've talked about the challenge, the flaws of institutions doing things, I suppose, to or for communities rather than with, and the negative consequences in a whole range of ways. But one of the things that we touched on before this conversation was that there's increasing listening and respect, but not actually things changing in real life as a result. And I wondered if that's something that you're happy to comment on, that I see, I suppose, spaces being created for Indigenous and Aboriginal perspectives, but then actually when it comes to decisions, that's where it doesn't quite follow through. And I'm interested in your diagnosis of why that is.
Well, I've seen in a lot of workplaces as well, people are quite comfortable with reaching out to communities and being the people who just asking communities what they want. But when it comes to us being experts within places that we're working or organisations, then there is that battle of power. It becomes very difficult because the race becomes very clear as me as an Aboriginal person. And I've noticed that even with Aboriginal people who have lighter skin colour than me, there's still this need to maintain power that Western society wants. And that's really what makes it hard for people to listen, because they begin to realise that they're about to lose power if they do anything past the listening part. The listening it's more of like a show to the world that you're doing something, but you're not actually doing something. And you could listen and then go away and do whatever you want to do. And then the outcome is completely different to what that listening actually involved. No one's taking in what they're hearing or reflecting on their own practice and how they exist in this world.
I know we're going to come on to look at and explore some of the structures and examples of ways of working through that. But I just want to pick up, you talked about country, and we've framed this conversation recognizing the importance of place. I'm keen to hear from both of you about your perspectives on, have institutions underestimated how much people need a sense of place? Is there a need at a deeply human level, and have institutions misunderstood or failed to engage or connect with that?
In my own research and the research that I draw upon, we are so much shaped by place in all sorts of different ways, whether it's by the built environment or the natural landscape. Our sense of that is also partly imagined as well. It's also something that we access through the stories we hear, through memories, through the culture we imbibe. So I tend to think of place as very integral to our sense of who we are. And then to come to this point about institutions and, in my sense, policy, I think it is just inherently challenging for institutions of government, which typically exist at kind of, large scales and are thinking about making interventions or delivering things to people across all sorts of kinds of places. They're almost, designed to be out of kilter with that. But I think there are two ways in which you can see that you can have a more productive relationship between governance and place. One is that we have structures of government that have developed at different scales. How governance is arranged at the really micro level has become increasingly important in the context of the dynamics I'm talking about, where people are increasingly worried and anxious and sometimes angry about how their own place has been treated. So I think this question of whether power can and should be devolved to local levels, that's become a really big live question. The other thing is whether it is possible and indeed necessary to do policy making in a way that is more mindful of place. I mean, to my mind, when you think about policy, you should always think about implementation as well as about design. They're implemented in places. They have consequences that vary depending on the makeup of populations, depending on the characteristics and history of places. So we need to be more mindful of how decisions that are taken, even at the national scale, or indeed above that globally, play out within particular places.
It's very interesting when you think people, also shaped by place. Even though it could be the exact same place, how we experience that place is very different. I am on Kaurna country, so that's Ghana with a K, and that's people who have lived on this land for over 60,000 years. So I think about their place on this land. So I'm not a Kaurna person. I'm Adnyamathanha and Ngarrindjeri, so they're basically north and south of this place. But then I also think about the buildings and that are placed on top of that and the histories within those buildings. I work on the North Terrace, which is one of the first areas of Adelaide that was built. And so I see these institutions, these older buildings, and I think about the histories and those policies. What are those decisions? I've come to Cambridge too, and I even became quite overwhelmed when I was there because I thought of the history and the weight of those places and the impact that a place like that has had on the world. So place is really important. How you experience that is very different. But for me, I think about connections and creating safety within places. That's one of the biggest things that I'm always working on now as someone who's worked in different institutions and realise that it's a very different experience for someone else to walk into the same building that I'm in. The people that they relate to are completely different. But because I seek those types of connections, I realise that there's a lot of people around me that don't even have those kind of connections. And I think that is what kind of makes the places very fragmented and there's no accountability to each other. There's nothing that actually connects us to make us realise that they're not just co-workers, we're all working kind of towards the same mission, but what is our purpose there? And I think for Aboriginal people, we all realise that we have a similar idea of why we want to be in the places that we are, and we're very privileged and fortunate to be in those places, but a lot of non-Aboriginal people just take it as a given that it's something that they are just entitled to.
Let's perhaps look at where things are working or could work. Are there examples where you find there has been quite a successful rethink of how the broader environment and institutional power has realigned itself with community, local communities in particular, and it's instructive? And you would say, look, this worked, we should do more of this. Are you seeing any of that? And if so, could you share?
So I think it's really important actually to look for examples of that embody hope and convey the sort of positive responses to these trends, because quite often it's easy, I think, to focus entirely on the negative aspects of it. Let me just give you two examples. So the local story is based on Preston, which is a city in the northwest of England, and has become, I think, fairly famous for this particular approach that it took some years back. It's all about community wealth building. So this was a council that was in dire trouble, with a lot of people who were struggling with outcomes like poor health, pay there was very low, unemployment higher than other nearby areas. And Preston is not a particularly well-connected place. That's one of its sort of big challenges economically. So what they decided to do was and this was very much forced out of a sense of crisis, that the existing ways of doing things are not working, was to focus very much on trying to build up local wealth and resource. I think they actually learned some lessons from Cleveland, Ohio in the US, which tried a similar model. They brought together all the key kind of anchor institutions in the town, including the university that's there, Lancaster, then the big hospital. I think the police and crime commissioner was involved, and various further education colleges. They brought them all together and they got them to buy into this approach, which involved a lot of local procurement. So they really supported them in trying to buy many more services and goods locally. And so that was the kind of demand side. And on the kind of supply side, they did a lot of work trying to promote local workers' cooperatives, put some seed funding into local businesses. And they tried to create a sort of new value chain, I think, locally, and to make sure that more of the money that was spent locally was also creating value locally rather than disappearing off to corporates or to other service providers elsewhere. And this didn't transform the entire place, because I would argue you'd need a wider change in the British economy. But a lot of good things happened. And one of the really striking things, so there's some really good economic outcomes, but actually local people, by and large, engaged really positively with this. And just very quickly, a totally different example to show that even kind of state level government can do good stuff in this space. The UK government developed this program, which I was looking abroad for this. It's called the Test, Learn and Grow program. And it basically runs pilot schemes and tests out solutions in different local areas, working with frontline staff and local service users. And the key bit of it is the local communities determine what the main problems are, and they come up with the ideas about where those priority needs are. So all sorts of different projects have rolled. It's very experimental. Some of them don't work, some of them do. And I think that experimental, locally rooted way of engaging with policy and being much more inclined to be led by what communities are saying they need, there's a wider set of lessons that you can draw out from that.
I would struggle to see a lot of things working, but what I have noticed, usually the times it works best is when it's led by Aboriginal communities. And I think maybe one of the best examples was during COVID, because Aboriginal people, our life expectancy is lower than non-Aboriginal people. Our health outcomes are terrible, and we only make up less than 3% of the population. So it's a hard group to support. But when it came to COVID, many of the communities acted a lot earlier than what the government was saying at the time. Many were able to actually stop people from coming in and create a system where they could talk amongst each other because they were able to trust each other. And I noticed it even in the way that families spoke to each other, that they were very aware that this was dangerous. And I think in reality, it probably stems from colonisation, the fact that disease came through and wiped out so many of our communities. Our nation's entire groups were wiped out from disease. When COVID did happen, we realised that this was something that could just devastate our communities because we had so many elders who would be at complete risk. They were able to make these decisions before anyone told them to and were able to support. And I think it was hard for a lot of people who weren't from those communities because I think they wanted to try to get in. It was very much, no, you cannot get in. And I think that's the only time where it really happens in the best way. I see little kind of more actions that work in other places, but nothing that really makes me think, oh, this is actually something that's quite transformative. People are still trying to catch up in other areas, I think.
Actions that you refer to there that work. Do you think there's a possibility to scale any of that?
I think a lot of the time when it works, it's because there's somebody from the community or someone from any other community that's not necessarily Aboriginal, but they might be from a migrant background or something, somewhere that understands the kind of struggle that we've had. Usually someone's fighting quite hard within an organisation to make the rest of the organisation do well. And so I've been in places where I've had to push further to say things need to slow down. Time is a big thing for us where you need to just take time to listen. Our communities work by using time, and I think everywhere else has a very short time frame, but we will quite often blow those time frames out. And usually you need somebody within there to say, no, you need to stop, you need to slow down, listen. Going back to find out, you're not going to get the answer straight away when you first talk to a community, because it's also that kind of issue where communities will tell you what you want. They'll listen, the group listens and they'll take that information, but it somehow gets messed up in this filter that things haven't translated well, even though we're speaking the same language. So it's just about how we, again, see the world and we live this world. And unless those conversations are taking time and you're really listening to understand, it's not going to work.
Let me see if I capture that. Is there a sense of what does work is when the institutional power base adopts an openness to the way of seeing the world of the local community, and then iterates, goes in a kind of repeating engagement, allowing a new meaning to emerge, which is so contrary to the kind of almost military machine-like Western corporation that sort of creates a project plan with measurable outcomes and so forth.
Yeah, you kind of have to flip the power imbalance and recognize everyone's on the same level, and taking that time to listen, that's the only way you're going to be able to throw that power imbalance.
I really recognise that, the challenge you're posing there, Marc, and I think it's really interesting. If you in the world of public policy, one of the most interesting and promising trends to emerge in the last decade or more has been the use of more deliberative kind of approaches to making decisions. So there's a whole range of different techniques for doing this, but trying to either engage communities or indeed in some very interesting cases having citizen panels kind of stand in for the views of ordinary people in the whole country. So the use of citizens' juries, deliberative mini publics, various kinds of deliberative processes to get at that kind of different speed that you're talking about, to try to get both something that's more iterative, but also compels the decision maker, the policy maker, to actually stand back a bit and respect the engagement and the conversation that goes on. Now, it's not the same thing as as what Jacinta's describing, because this is not a whole community. This is, these are people who are either randomly selected or are representative in some shape or form. But, it is really striking how many of these kind of deliberative techniques are now used. There are some bits of local government in this country and elsewhere, city government, that has standing panels of citizens that it turns to, when it's thinking about a hard issue, and it says, look, take this issue away and then come back to us in 6 months with a more considered view. And innovation can happen around that kind of method, I think. There is a growing recognition on the part of many policymakers that unless you really have a deeper understanding of how ordinary people feel and think about particular issues, the solutions you may try and impose just may well not fly, they may well not work, or indeed be counterproductive.
How then to ensure that those processes don't get captured just by the loudest voices?
It's a big issue. I think it's an issue actually more sort of generally, isn't it, with the various kinds of consultation that governments attempt to have with different communities. So one answer to that is to say, okay, so randomly select people. So you don't necessarily get the loudest voices or the people who are sufficiently time rich or confident, who will always sort of come to the fore, or generally come to the fore if you do have a kind of open consultation. So that there may be ways of designing in, something that offsets that. I think this is a big issue because in the context of sort of debates about how should we reform our governance model, certainly in this context in the UK, there are some people who say, look, the way to really get at this issue about lack of trust and people's feeling that their place is being neglected, maybe the answer to that is to devolve lots of things down to the smallest scale possible and to have a much more kind of decentralized democratic system. And the problem with that is that it's almost a kind of reversal. It's like taking our system and turning it upside down, and not necessarily addressing some of the dynamics and issues around power and voice, and particularly power within communities. The problem is when you do community engagement, there always has to be this question asked of whose voices are we hearing? Where are the voices that have maybe been set to one side in that community? I think it is the job of government at different levels to be alive to that and to think about minorities within communities and not to overly romanticize the single voice of the community, because there is no such thing. There's always those dynamics around power.
I'm wondering how this plays out in your context, Jacinta. The example you gave around COVID talked about the power of existing community networks. You talked about family networks there as part of that. How are those existing networks able to move quickly and drive action? But I don't know if this issue that we've just exploring is one that is relevant, and whether there are solutions there.
It happens all the time that there's usually one. It is often the person who is able and open to speaking, and it's good that there are those voices, but I do know that a lot of voices aren't heard. When these institutions are trying to reach out to our people, they do see their voice and do think, okay, that's a good person, that's a person that we can go to. They're well known, and it's kind of like placing this idea of what a well-known, knowledgeable person is onto our own communities, whereas for us, we don't think in a hierarchical way. We think more so that there's a lot of people within our community. We all can't speak for the same thing. We have our own areas that we can speak to. And in reality, you would go to this person who can speak to those things, but that often doesn't happen. In my own work, I would work directly with my own community. In getting feedback, I try my hardest to respect everybody, because I think everybody has their own opinions, own voices, and everyone should get heard. So I do that. I do that thing where I just talk to people in their own groups so that they are all heard. And some people might not want to come together all in one forum. And I could see that happening in any kind of community forum where people don't feel comfortable with being in the same room with people who may be oppressors in their own community. So not necessarily in Aboriginal communities, but for when we have to go into maybe council meetings or things where we are not in our own spaces, we're uncomfortable, you actually have to reach out and talk to the people who are not talking in those places. The quiet people, I think, usually are seeing a lot and do have a lot to say. Quite often it's the organisation saying, come to us, and we're creating this one meeting, you come to this meeting, it has to happen around this time. If only that group is going to come, that's the people that we're going to consult with. And that's not fair on the rest of the community, the rest of the people that the work's going to affect. It's not fair.
So I'm really struck around the need to, in some ways, go slow to be able to go fast and be effective, the need to be deliberative and inclusive, and the potential challenges of then the scaling and the pace in light of some of the huge challenges that societies face, and the need for quite rapid action in order to protect those that are most vulnerable in society. I'm wondering, is the answer that ceding of power and empowerment, not just, I suppose, engagement of, but whether it's devolution or handing power to communities and supporting the strength of local networks and communities in order that they can respond quickly in the way, the example that you gave around COVID? Or is there another approach that will enable both that inclusiveness and relevance and the trust building with the scale and the speed of where some changes might be needed?
I think it's partly in my world, so thinking about, governance in response to that kind of issue. I think a lot of it is about what is the scale at which the relevant authority is working. So, if you're talking about national government or even a bit further down the scale, but it's here, say, regional government or say provincial government in many countries. I mean, the scale is such that those administrations, they may be doing a bit of outreach. They may realise that they need to understand their local populations in different places. But frankly, their core business is, as you say, about delivering pretty quickly various social goods or economic goods or enforcing regulations at scale, and being able to do pretty much the same thing in different places. So being kind of insensitive to places kind of built in is almost a kind of necessity. In the last few years, I think there has been a bit of a shift towards thinking in many different sort of countries, particularly, in and around Europe, where I think those central governments in particular have started to think about what are they not being able to do, or where are they being overstretched? Where are they trying to deliver goods which actually would be more effectively and efficiently delivered lower down at sort of smaller scales of governance? And that's why, if you look really historically, the last 50 years, lots and lots of countries have actually decentralized in lots of ways. Here's the rub of it, that even to deliver in those kind of place insensitive ways, actually, it increasingly, I think people are realizing that it makes sense to be much better informed, to build into your evaluations of policies, your assessment of outcomes, how they are playing out in different places. Because actually, you want the knowledge that generates to feed back into the policy process, which always iterates. It's never that you do one thing and then just completely leave it for 10 years. You want those feedback loops. The value of good community engagement, whatever that looks like, the value of listening or understanding a community better, is that for a policymaker, that's where knowledge lies. It's actually to understand what's going on in a place, what a place needs to, say, turn itself round or to deal with particular issues. You need to get to that knowledge, a lot of which is often tacit. It's often unspoken. It's not written down anywhere. One of the most interesting trends is seeing many different kinds of policymakers and governments beginning to realise that governing by a spreadsheet alone is not enough, that actually you need to supplement those forms of information and data, all of which is obviously incredibly important, with other kinds of knowledge, and that's the value of engaging communities. It's not just to make them like you more, to try to legitimise your policies. You actually learn stuff. There's resource there. And that, I think, can point to actually much more creative and productive policy.
Thank you. I'm interested to come back to points around narrative and stories and imagination. I think imagination was a point you highlighted earlier. And you've both spoken about some of the approaches that institutions should embrace, but we haven't spoken about the potential embracing of narrative or storytelling by institutions. And I'm aware that communities often have stories that sustain their meaning and identity and heritage and culture. But I'm also aware that populist politicians are very effective in using narrative and stories that are very good at evoking emotion or a sense of grievance or, in some cases, political tribalism. I'm interested in whether you think institutions should be, I suppose, embracing narrative as a core strategic capability, or is that just really manipulative?
I mean, it depends on the area, but story is really important, particularly for my communities, because every kind of place or institution has interacted with us in particular ways, and actually acknowledging the past and what places have done has been very impactful to communities in being able to move forward and do new things and actually repair relationships. So usually I think it's quite useful to talk about the stories of those places and what they've meant to different communities. Thinking about what new relationships, new stories could be created is really key to moving forward, and thinking about how to move those two things together, because creating space for Aboriginal people or other communities to be able to talk to those places, I think it helps to develop and build a trust that has never existed previously.
I really like that. That also bridges to where I was going to go next, which is there potential to create new stories for the future? Because many of the community stories, and certainly some of the populist political rhetoric, tends to be looking backwards about getting back to how good it used to be in the past, rather than necessarily a great forward-looking, allowing new stories to emerge. But you do see the potential for learning from and understanding the stories that exist, but then co-creating new stories. And you think that in itself is a potentially powerful, promising way forward.
Yeah, I've helped with some trainings, cultural awareness trainings, about teaching the history to a particular institution. I won't say who they were, but I was able to give that history to them to help them understand why Aboriginal people feel a particular way towards them. And a lot of the people within that institution were completely unaware that that is what that legacy of that place was. And through understanding that, they could realise that the actions that they were taking were really impacting and being very negative.
Thank you.
Back on the question about whether institutions need to be more geared to telling stories, and I think this is a really important question, actually, because we think about it a lot in terms of the training we do, the teaching we do of future policymakers. And in my counter to because there is in the public policy world, there is I think still a bit of an ingrained prejudice against the idea of storytelling, because you'll hear people say, oh, well, that's about anecdotes. We need to actually have huge data. That's going to give us a better understanding of a problem. Now, I'm not against big data. We do a lot of work with big data ourselves, and I want policymakers to be really good at analysing it too. But the fact is that, if you're a policymaker, you're telling stories all the time. You're engaged in framing. You may have that minute with the minister where you've got to get them to understand the nature of a problem or why a certain solution is the thing you need to drive at. Or you may just be talking to your colleagues or various other stakeholders. And I think it's a real mistake, actually, to think that storytelling is just in some sense sort of dubious. It's purely about kind of manipulation. I do think, and something we're building into the work we're doing and the courses we're planning, training policymakers, thinking about storytelling, thinking about the power of narrative alongside the other tools in their armory. And then if I may, just to go to this question about nostalgia, which you raised, which I think is really interesting. I think nostalgia is really important. And it's something else I think that there's often too much of a kind of prejudice against. Nostalgia is a very human emotion. And what nostalgia can do is, if you think about it, it can give us a sense of how things might otherwise be. And often that's done by sort of projecting it onto the past. And I certainly accept that often a lot of nostalgia is entirely maybe inaccurate or may not be entirely, true to the past. But think, for instance, about talking about some of the communities. I've been talking about places that feel very left behind. In many of those places, people tell a story about their place where they'll say, look, 30, 40 years ago, people here trusted each other. And we used to leave our doors open. And we used to, crime was lower. There was much greater trust. We didn't need people from outside coming in, sorting out problems. People generally looked out for one another. Now, the historian in me thinks that probably is often overstated, may not be entirely accurate, but the story that comes from that form of nostalgia is, I think, very powerful and is something that could be harnessed for good in the here and now. Where I think nostalgia is something to be worried about is when political projects come along where people say, let's recreate this imagined past in a particular respect, which actually has very damaging consequences for parts of our community in the here and now. So I completely can see nostalgia can be used for ill, but it can also, I think, be used for good. And I think it's one of the things we need to think about, the value of the past, and to develop forms of understanding of communities, of places that respect the fact that these places have their own stories, their own pasts. And if you're a policymaker, you really will not engage well with the community or really get what it needs, I would argue, unless you have a sense of the stories it tells itself.
So bringing us to the last sort of topic here, interested in what gives either of you, both of you, any confidence that the future is potentially going to be better with regard to local communities, Indigenous communities, than the present. I'm really interested to hear any optimism that we could bring to the world in this regard, because it is a very challenging space.
I don't think I have as much confidence as other people probably do. I think any movement forward, I think, will be very hard, and it's always very hard. And I think it's always going to take people doing a lot of work. I've been a bit more surprised more recently by leadership in different ways, but I've also been really let down. But I kind of think maybe those little pieces of areas where there are leaders who are doing good work and are listening and taking the time, in a way, they give me a little bit of confidence, but I'm always very skeptical of what people are doing.
We will absolutely hold on to the little bit of confidence that you've got there and work with that. Marc, yourself?
I mean, I think there are some grounds for optimism in terms of the issues I've been talking about, whilst I'm also very much a realist about these things. And I think my sort of sense of the history of the deep challenges emerging from our changing economies does, I think, give me a lot of ground for concern and worry about how easy it is going to be to kind of address some of these issues. But I do think, one thing I really hold on to is that in the space around local community action, engagement, but also local politics, actually, and parts of local government and devolved government in this country. There are some great people and there is some great work going on despite all the challenges, and the constraints are very real, particularly financial constraints. I'm just continually impressed, actually, been given some inspiration from things and people you come across in that space who defy the odds, I think. And so there's a lot of good work, interesting and innovative work out there. But I think the challenge is to kind of find a way of scaling it, is to find a way of aggregating some of that, and particularly find a way of bringing some of that into the much harder, more unyielding structures and culture of central government. I think that's where so much power still lies. That's a real challenge. I think beyond that, I would say that just in a sort of at the level of ideas and argument, I mean, I think some of the things I'm talking about, the importance of place, the value, the need to sort of have a more place conscious approach to public policy, this was a lot harder argument to make 10 years ago than it is today. And I see there's been a lot of opening up to that. I still think we've got a long way to go to find the kinds of solutions that are going to stick in relation to some of these issues.
Thank you very much for joining us today. You've shared an appropriate level concern. If we weren't concerned, we wouldn't really be paying attention to the significant challenges that we face. But you've also shared some really rich insights in the pathway to the pathways forward, and I've certainly learned a lot. We've heard about the importance of hope and a focus on what is possible. We've talked about the positive power of stories of the past. We've acknowledged the importance of engaging with timeframes, of tenacity, of patience, of deliberative processes, but the importance of scaling as well. And that requires experimentation, it requires iteration, it requires drawing on and learning from community insights, from benefiting from tacit knowledge. And the value of engaging with existing community networks, of really making the most of the strengths that communities already have. But most fundamentally, we've acknowledged the importance of engaging with and recognizing power dynamics. If institutions are going to effectively deliver for the communities that they serve, they'll need to be much greater embracing of co-owned processes and governance that really includes and embraces communities and community perspectives in order to achieve better outcomes.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Marc, Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.